We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. In this chapter, the introduction and reply to Jean Hyppolite's presentation of Freud's Verneinung, Lacan makes clear that the biggest obstacle to the course of the therapeutic process is the patient's ego and the analyst's ego. Both must be kept in check for the therapy to work. When patients enter therapy, their speech is dominated by their ego, always putting in check what they ought or ought not to say. That's what they're doing usually during the therapeutic process, according to Lacan, at least in the initial stages. Lacan says on page 52, quote, "The moment when the subject interrupts himself is usually the most significant moment in his approach towards the truth. At this point we gain a sense of resistance in its pure state, which culminates in the feeling, often tinged with anxiety, of the analyst's presence." According to Lacan, patients interrupting themselves are often signs that their ego feels threatened by the analyst. But what is helpful about this moment in the process, Lacan says, is that it brings to awareness how bound up the patient's ego is in view of the analyst's perspective. Lacan says this moment shows, quote, "that the subject's discourse, insofar as it doesn't attain this full speech in which its base in the unconscious should be revealed, is already addressed to the analyst, is so made as to interest him, and is supported by this alienated form of being that one calls the ego." Lacan goes on to say, also on page 52, quote, "The relation of the ego to the other, the relation of the subject to this other himself, to this fellow being in relation to whom he is initially formed, is an essential structure of the human constitution." According to Lacan, the ego was formed in light of some idea of an abstract authority figure in the past, and it's essential to us. So it's not as if the ego is to be destroyed or anything like that. Instead, it is supposed to be, during the therapeutic process and the healing of the suffering, to be somehow sublated. And Lacan distinguishes between the ego in psychology, which could have other meanings. You can mean as many things as you want by the word ego, and the meaning of ego for psychoanalysis, which has a particular meaning. Lacan says on page 53, the ego makes manifest in psychoanalysis as defense, as refusal. Inscribed in it is the entire history of successive oppositions which the subject manifested to the integration of what will subsequently be called within the theory, but only subsequently, his deepest and most understood drives. He says also on page 53, the fundamental function of the ego is misunderstanding. So our ego is a fundamental problem. It's always going to be there with us, but it keeps us from getting at what we truly desire and that which must be recovered during the therapeutic process. Let's go ahead and stop here. Thank you for listening.